why don't we have Alan take over the screen as well as the slides. Go ahead, Alan. Thank you.
Can you guys see this?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, we can.
Okay, yes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about possible commercial leases, which is something that I handle mostly on the tenant side, a little bit on the landlord side, and so I think that it's something that for many people who are entrepreneurs will have to deal with. Their commercial leases from any type of business, whether like Sylvia for a law firm, or many of my clients are restaurateurs, which are particularly hard hit. So I just want to talk a little bit about that. And yeah, obviously retail and the restaurant industry have been impacted the most due to stay-at-home orders, and even for states without stay-at-home orders or less strict stay-at-home orders, people generally are more afraid to go out, which has impacted business significantly. And even before all that happened, there was a lot of decreased demand, particularly for Asian-owned restaurants and things like that, or particularly Chinese restaurants. There are articles about that, for better or worse. So for anybody that has a commercial lease, you have to understand that no matter where you are, a lot of what you can or cannot do, what your landlord can or cannot do, is going to be governed by your lease terms. So the first step will be definitely to review the lease, in particular, also to look at the force majeure clause, but to look at any of the rights that you have, or notice requirements in particular for anything, which usually require written notice to the other party in a specified format, etc. And then in addition to the landlord, you may want to also contact any other service providers you have for your point of sale system, or utilities or maintenance, such as HVAC or pest cleaning or whatnot, to see what can be done about any ongoing contracts that you might have with them, as well as product suppliers, particularly for, say, restaurants and things like that. Now, aside from that, it is more and more common now that commercial leases will, the landlord will require you to have a business interruption insurance or business income insurance. It's probably more commonly known as now. And so you should review your commercial insurance policy to see if you have business interruption insurance, and if so, what your coverage limits are, etc., which I'll also go into a little bit later on. But the best bet here, for most of you, you're not spending a lot of time on this, on reviewing the policy, in fact. So the best bet here is to talk to your agent that you purchased the insurance from. Most of you probably got the insurance through an agent, and they'll be able to walk you through filing a claim, etc., and oftentimes will be your point of contact between you and the insurance company once a claim has been made. And so for today, I'm going to focus a little bit on, specifically talking to the landlord about assistance in paying rent, whether asking for an abatement or deferment of some kind. And the best thing to realize is that you should be proactive and kind of don't hesitate to reach out. Don't wait until the rent is due or past due. In fact, the sooner you start talking to them, the more time you'll have to prepare whatever documentation they ask from you, and to explain your side and make it seem like you're really trying to do your best to make it through. And because at the end of the day, for the most part, whether a landlord agrees to give any type of rent relief is pretty much completely in their discretion. And a lot of times the force majeure clause will specifically exclude rent payment obligations as something that would be told through a force majeure clause, whereas your other obligations would be covered. So that's something to, and this is more reason why to review, a force majeure clause in the lease. And also, for many people, while money is tight, you want to try to review these documents that you've already signed or things that you have in place already without your attorney at first, just to kind of understand it. You may ask your attorney for questions, but even when you're talking to the landlord, you can do that at first without an attorney necessarily. Just be aware that if things are, if there's an agreement of some kind, an amendment needs to be made, that should be reviewed by an attorney, or at least drafted by the attorney, or if they drafted it, then you should have your attorney review it, and things like that. But the initial communication with the landlord, you don't need an attorney to do that. And so also, and this is important for landlords as well, which I'm sure Mina will touch on, but as the tenant, you should also kind of pay attention to whether your state or municipality has put into place any moratoriums, which may ultimately impact your decision on whether or not to pay the rent. If, say, you make a request for rent relief and it's not given by a landlord, or things, or you have other more pressing things like payroll that you want to do, etc. Okay. And also, it's important to note that if you had an agent, a commercial agent or a broker, probably the landlord will want to talk to you directly still, rather than through the broker. And also, many times landlords have a mortgage on the property, in which case their lender may also have requirements or want to ask questions of you before they allow the landlord to do anything. And on another note, so if you are talking to your landlord about rent relief, other things you may also want to talk to them about is, if you're able to open, adjusting your store hours though, because many leases have a requirement for a certain amount of operation in terms of the days and hours, and also for signage. So if you switch to a model where you're doing delivery or takeout primarily, and you want to put signs, maybe somewhere in the shopping center, closer to the side of the road, where people can see it, so that they can, call in and make orders, you should talk to your landlord about that. Most leases will require that you get permission from a landlord before you place any signage outside, or even in the windows of the space. So definitely, those are some important reasons to review your lease. And I have included a sample relief letter to your landlord. You can contact your landlord by sending a letter via email or by giving a phone call, but always things in writing are going to be better. So even if you do have a phone call, it's good to follow up with something in writing. And very simply, if you do choose to send something in the letter format, you just kind of say, re coronavirus, and you want to be clear on your name and the address, the space that you're renting, and then mention that you've been unable to do business, whether due to a forced shutdown or due to highly decreased demand. Those are both very valid reasons to choose to close down. And then something like this to ask them to work together with you, and then realize that many of your landlords, also this does matter whether you are in a shopping center owned by a smaller landlord or a kind of national REIT. Typically, I would think that the smaller landlords with more personal relationships would be more willing to help you out, but at the same time, they may also have a harder time in helping out, because if they have a mortgage, etc., then maybe they don't have the ability to pay if they're not receiving rent, things like that. So it's important to kind of understand your situation with your particular landlord and kind of go from there and request something reasonable. Let's see. Because when you make a request, there's several things you can ask for in terms of rent relief, which will be, primarily a rent reduction, rent abatement, or rent deferral. And your landlord is going to ask for many of these documents or more, such as a personal financial statement and maybe 3 months or so of bank statements. Maybe 2 years or so of your business tax returns, a credit check, which at this time you may want to try to decline the credit check and opt to provide more of other documentation instead, because having the credit check may impact your score. And evidence of any aid or help you've already applied for, such as what Sylvia talked about in her presentation from the PPP or EIDL, because part of that money could be used to, apply for your rent, right? And even though right now all of that money is gone, but if Congress expands the amount of money, the amount of funding available, then that might come into play. But overall, that helps the lender understand your situation and see that you've been making an effort. And they may also ask for a copy of your insurance policy or want to know whether you filed a claim or not and the results or updates regarding that claim, because oftentimes, and we'll go into this right after, but your business interruption insurance will specifically cover rent payments. Yeah. Okay, and so going into the types of rent relief that are possible, the rent abatement is probably most ideal for a tenant. An abatement just means it's a period of free rent. Oftentimes you'll see rent abatement, at the beginning of a lease when you're doing your build-out period or things like that. Sometimes you'll have to pay the common area charges, but in this case, you would probably ask for rent abatement from the principal rent, plus also any common area charges if you've just been forced to close. Or at the very least, if they're not willing to offer full rent abatement, then you can ask for just abatement on the base rent. Otherwise, a reduction, which is just a percentage reduction in the amount of rent that you're paying. And then the third option is deferral, which is probably the landlord's preference, because it allows them to retain all of the possible money that they make from you by kind of just pushing back the time frame for the payments. And so here's a few possible deferral structures. So number one is just adding to the end of the term. So if you defer for 3 months, then your lease term gets extended for an additional 3 months after, or to split them into payments and then add that on to an end of the lease term, or to amortize with interest. So that one you may end up paying a significant amount more if you choose to do it that way. So that's probably not preferable to you when you're discussing the options. For the tenant, probably the easiest thing to do is to just ask for the deferred months to be added on to the end of the lease term. That way your rent payments aren't going to change from whatever rent schedule you're used to, or the rent schedule in your lease schedule, but just extended. And again, any changes, make sure that they end up being documented in an amendment, so that you can have something to fall back on if you need to show that it's something different than what was originally agreed to in the lease. And oftentimes this will be drafted by your landlord's attorney though, and it may include a confidentiality clause So do pay attention to that and be sure not to violate such clauses, because your landlord doesn't want to let everybody know, all the other tenants know or whatnot, if they've given you some kind of deal, because everybody's deal may be different depending on everybody's situation. It's also important to note that if you're asking for rent relief, but you are toward the end of your term, the landlord, first, if you're near the end of your term, the landlord might not be as focused on exploring any renewals or extensions with you. So if you have any holdover provisions in your lease, usually there are, then you should be careful about that, because usually the holdover period rent is between 150% to 200% of your normal rent. But also, if you're asking for a rent abatement toward the end of the lease, your landlord may be less willing to work with you on that because you're almost out, and so they may want to try to relet to somebody else or just force you to pay what you have left, and those are definitely things to consider. But the landlords are generally going to look at the overall stability of their shopping center and whether they think they can release the space to another tenant, or with either with a better credit history, better payment history, or higher rent. But the situation has been affecting, the demand for spaces. So, that may not be as feasible as they would like. So in that, I would say that by now it's more likely that the landlord is willing to work with people. Now, landlords may send you something like an application for you to request the rent relief. So this is something that you can kind of look at. This is just a sample. It may include more or less documentation requirements, but as you see here, it's your reason for the request, sales reports, tax returns, business plan, details of what a statement on what efforts you've already been made, and your expense information until the end of the year, etc. Okay, and next we have business income insurance. A little bit more on that. So it is designed to cover an unexpected closure or situations that would result in the loss of a business income. So many emergencies such as fires or earthquakes or whatnot. And it can specifically cover full rent payments. Landlords started to require this more in commercial leases because they want to be paid. And if you have this insurance, then obviously you're much less likely to get any rent relief if your business income is covering it. However, insurance companies will probably try their best not to pay you, whether to find an exclusion of some type or otherwise. I would say that right now, most of your policies probably don't have a specific exclusion for pandemics or epidemics, though some might have exclusions for virus, though it's unclear whether or not it's an exclusion for virus that happens at your store, or if in this case your business is unable to be opened because of a larger pandemic. And there's, I think, some ongoing litigation already between tenants that are trying to make claims against insurance companies, so we'll see how that plays out. But again, right now it's pretty unprecedented, the scale and magnitude of the pandemic and the effect it has on everybody. So unsure how that all will play out. But if your policy language is broad enough, then you can certainly make a claim and make a good argument that you have the ability, that this should be covered. Now, types of recovery. So for lost income, either through destroyed merchandise or lost sales, in the case of restaurants, etc., minus the expenses you paid, such as for shipping, etc. And then for extra expenses, if you have to temporarily relocate, etc. But that probably doesn't apply for COVID-19. but your rent may be under the lost extra expenses rather than the lost income. And typically there'll be something, I'm sorry, so typically your pre-loss earnings are used as the basis for reimbursement for lost income. So they'll look at past years in terms of your sales numbers, and then calculate the percentage of that, or give, and we'll factor in the restoration period. A lot of times it's going to be about a year, up to a year rather, and a lot of times that can't be extended by you. So even if it ends up going, if this pandemic ends up going longer than a year that you'd be out of business, your recovery under the policy may only be up to a year, and there's a little waiting period before the restoration period would kick in, right? Which is just 2 or 3 days period. But again, you can find out more by talking to your insurance agent. They will be experienced in handling claims and the ins and outs of your policy. Other provisions to be on the lookout for: crisis management coverage. So it covers crisis normally like a violent act, but also being shut down for food contamination or communicable disease. So we're not sure if COVID-19 would count as communicable disease, but usually, like I said, it probably means, if some instance of the disease was found in your restaurant, right? So, but if you've had any employees that were, tested positive or whatnot, then that might very much apply here. Also, if you have a supplier that's that shut down, even if you're still operating, then that might come into play because you're unable to get certain items that you need, right? Or, whether due to a government lockdown or whatnot. And then the third is the civil authority coverage. So if your business is interrupted by the federal, state, or city government mandates, such as the stay-at-home orders that are affecting most, probably 45 out of 50 states or so now. However, there's also a key consideration. Like I said, the insurance companies are trying to probably do their best not to pay you. And most of these claims will say that you need to have suffered some kind of physical property loss in order to make a claim. However, in this current circumstance, even though there's no physical damage due to fire, flood, or other disaster, there's still an argument that it would be covered under physical loss, because if you are forced to shut down and don't have access to the restaurant. And again, I think that's probably the subject of some of the litigation that's going on now, so we'll see how courts rule on that. However, if you are switching to another mode where you are doing, delivery or takeout for the restaurants, then that would probably mean that you're not going to be able to make a business insurance loss because you're still operating, just less. Okay, and that's all I have for this part. I think Mina will talk a little bit more from the landlord side of things. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. Thank you.